Hello there, beautiful best friends. Hi, how are you? Yes, you are. Speaking with third coffee of the day, Liz again. Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me once again in our safe, cozy little space of the internet. It is so lovely to see your face again, and I hope you're having a wonderful week. If you are new here, then hi, my name is Liz, and I am so happy that you randomly stumbled across this video. Like, it is fate. And just so you know, we are joined today by my big awkward guest star slash arguably the real star of the show, Lily, because she hates being excluded and will not let me lock her out of the room while I record. So fun. So you can expect to hear noise disturbances here and there in the background, but also top-notch emotional support breaks from Lily because she is an emotional support goddess. To be honest, I do sometimes get the impression that some people tune in just to see Lily every week, and there probably is a lot for me to unpack there when it comes to my own self-worth and ego, but instead I'm just gonna sit here and pretend everything's okay. They love me too, right? Do they? You are going to take over one day, aren't you, Lily? So today we're talking about an Australian case, and it's a case that is considered to be among the most brutal and disturbing crimes to have ever occurred here, like ever. So as usual, I am thrilled to see you guys again and to be hanging out and everything, but we all know it's not going to be just a light, casual little chat for us today, but it never is for us, is it? So we're going to go back in time to July 2009 and meet a woman named Kathy Lynn. Kathy lived in a nice, peaceful, middle-class suburb just outside of Sydney, New South Wales, called North Epping. Kathy lived with her husband, Robert Z, and both of them had immigrated to Australia from China a few years back, and they were a family of three. They had a son together, but they were also very close with Kathy's brother's family, the LIN family, who are actually our main focus today. The LIN family was made up by Kathy's brother, 45-year-old Min Lin, Min's wife, 43-year-old Lily Lin, and their three kids, 15-year-old Brenda, 12-year-old Henry, and 9-year-old Terry. Just like Kathy and Robert, Min and Lily had also immigrated from China as university students, and they met and fell in love while they were both studying in Sydney. And Min and Lily didn't have a whole lot to begin with when they were just starting their lives together until, with a bit of help from their parents, Min opened up a news agency in Sydney, and he worked very, very hard, 7 days a week, nearly 365 days a year to build this news agency from the ground up. And they saved really hard over the years as well, as Min and Lily started their own family and had their three beautiful children, Brenda, Henry, and Terry. And all of Min's hard work to provide for his family and give his children what he and Lily had never had definitely paid off. By 2009, the news agency was a huge success. It brought in about $1 million a year in revenue. And so the Lin family were able to live in a modest but nice two-story home, very close to Kathy and Robert's house, like extremely close. The two families were only separated by about a 3-minute walk across the park and down this long driveway that led to the Lin family's home. Side note, if you are not a fellow Aussie and are just sitting there like, I'm sorry, what is a news agency? It's kind of like our equivalent to what most countries would call a convenience store or a newsstand, I guess. So they sell newspapers, magazines, lottery tickets, cigarettes, snacks, all of that kind of stuff. And the news agency had been that successful that Min had been able to get holdings in other shop fronts on that same strip. Also living with the Lin family was Lily's sister, 39-year-old Irene, who helped out by working at the news agency part-time. And Min had been able to buy a house for his parents, who had also immigrated to Australia. And so they were living in Sydney as well, only about half an hour away. So it was all really nice and cozy. You know, like I can only imagine how scary and potentially lonely and isolating it must be to just up and move from the country that you were born and raised in and move to the other side of the world. So it was really nice that Kathy and Robert and the Lin family all had each other and that they were so close. And the whole family would get together almost every Friday night for family night dinners and just saying that as a die-hard Gilmore Girls fan. I'm trying my very best not to be entirely distracted thinking about Emily and Richard having Lorelai and Rory over for dinner every Friday night.
Now we all agreed to have Friday night dinner, and we're here, and I smell dinner.
Yes, we love Gilmore Girls, don't we? You are a total Rory, let's be real.
Where you lead, I will follow.
Yeah, I may have entirely lost my train of thought just thinking about Gilmore Girls. Back to Kathy, who we met to begin with. It was actually just after one of these family Friday night dinners that Kathy woke up the following morning having no idea that her life was about to change forever. It was the morning of Saturday, the 18th of July, 2009. And from about 9 a.m. onwards, Kathy started getting these phone calls from customers of Min's agency because Min had never opened the store that morning. Like, there was this big stack of newspapers just sitting there out the front, and Min had never turned up to bring them in. And this was extremely out of the ordinary because, like we said, Min worked at that agency 7 days a week, especially on a Saturday because it was a particularly busy day for the business. Like rain, hail, or shine, Min could have been half dead with the plague and he would still be there on time opening up that store. And so he was a staple in the lives of a lot of the locals who dropped in every morning to get their newspapers and magazines. So when Kathy got these phone calls about the news agency being closed and people seeing no sign of Min, that was all it took for her to instantly know that something was very wrong. So she went and grabbed her husband, Robert, who was busy cleaning the garage, saying, "Stop what you're doing right now because we need to go and check on Min." So the couple walked over to the LIN family house, getting there at about 10 a.m. And just to add to what I would imagine to be Kathy's already growing anxiety, when they tried the front door, they found that it was unlocked. But then when they stepped inside, everything from first appearances was perfectly normal. The family's shoes were piled up at the front door, the kids' backpacks were there, and the keys were in the bowl where they usually were. So assuming that everyone was home, Kathy and Robert both called out, but they got no response. And this was when Kathy went upstairs to see what was going on. And the second she reached the bedrooms, she was met with an absolute nightmare. Like, it is so strange that everything on the lower level was so normal because upstairs there was blood splattered everywhere, floor to ceiling, on the doorknobs, on the power sockets, on the phone chargers, absolutely everywhere. And while running hysterically through the rooms, Kathy saw that there were at least 4 bodies of members of the LIN family just also absolutely covered in blood. So she rushed downstairs and called 000. And you can easily find a recording of this call online. It's very disturbing to listen to because Kathy is obviously beside herself and hysterical, but also it's incredibly frustrating to listen to as well because the operator is quite short with her and impatient and keeps cutting her off, telling her to stop screaming and to calm down, because I know personally those are things I would totally be able to do if I had just found my brother's family murdered and covered in blood. But in this phone call, the operator is mainly getting frustrated and snappy over the fact that he can't get a straight answer out of Kathy on whether she had seen Min or not, because she's all over the place. She's speaking in English part of the time, then switching back to Cantonese here and there, and she's trying to describe the scene and begging for him to send police and an ambulance. But the operator keeps pushing. Have you seen your brother? Have you seen your brother? Trying to find out if Min was on the scene. Like, right from the get-go, with so little information to go off, there is this unspoken assumption that Min was responsible for the murders of his wife and children. Meanwhile, while Kathy is still speaking with the operator, she's begging in Cantonese for Robert, her husband, to stay with her because Robert is there in the background saying, "I need to go and tell your parents what's happened right now." And he leaves Kathy there. Like, they still have no real idea what's going on, if Min is okay, if he was the killer, if he's still on the scene. And Robert just leaves Kathy alone at the house. So Basically, poor Kathy is being let down left, right, and centre. Paramedics and the police did arrive pretty quickly to the home, but it was abundantly clear that it was too late to save anyone inside. They found Lily Lynn lying on the bed of the master bedroom. Her sister, Irene, was slumped against her bed in the bedroom across the hall. And then the boys, Henry and Terry, were found dead on the floor of the bedroom that they shared. When it came to Min, his body was in fact the last to be found, as in he wasn't found until about an hour or two after the rest of the victims' bodies were discovered. And it was actually Kathy that had to tell the police to check under the blanket in the master bedroom, and sure enough, there was Min's body lying directly next to Lily's body. And this little delay, I mean, it doesn't have a huge impact in the grand scheme of the rest of the case, but I just got so stuck on it because I might be wrong, but it basically seems as though police didn't even bother looking properly for Min's body. Like they missed it entirely because they had jumped straight to that conclusion that Min was the killer and had fled the scene, when in reality, Min was as much of a victim as the rest of his family. The killings themselves were especially brutal. All 5 of the victims had been beaten to death with a hammer-like object, and 4 of the 5 victims also showed signs of asphyxiation, as though they had been strangled first to subdue them before they were then bludgeoned. And it was Min and Lily's injuries that were particularly horrific, especially to their faces, to the point that when Min's body was eventually found, paramedics and police assumed that he had been shot point blank in the face. But this wasn't the case at all. Min and Lily had just been beaten that severely that investigators had to rely on forensic analysis to confirm their identities. The only person missing from the home was 15-year-old Brenda. However, she wasn't missing. Brenda had actually left a few days earlier to go on a week-long school trip with her Year 10 class to New Caledonia in France as part of her French studies. And Brenda says that the night before she left on this school trip, she was excited, obviously, but also really nervous. So she gave her mum Lily a big hug, and her youngest brother Terry and her aunt Irene had already gone to bed, but she spoke with the 12-year-old Henry and told him that she would miss him, but it would just be a week and then she would be back. Like, it sounds like the Lynn kids got along so well. They all had similar interests and they would read books and play video games together on the couch. Brenda says that Henry was super friendly and outgoing like her dad, and her youngest brother, Terry, would follow her around like a puppy in that way that kid brothers do, because he just adored his big sister. But this is the part that breaks me. Brenda says that the next morning, when it came to leave on her big trip to France, Min drove her to the airport bright and early at 4 a.m. And when they got there, all of her classmates were hugging their parents and saying these big, dramatic goodbyes. Some of them were even crying. But Brenda, just being 15, all of these emotional goodbyes were just making her super uncomfortable. And so she shifted into like moody teenager mode. And her and Min just kind of stood there awkwardly because Brenda thought all of her friends were being totally lame, making this big deal out of nothing when it was just going to be a week and then they would be home. So it sounds like her and Min barely even said a proper goodbye. And then Min left, and that was the last time that Brenda ever saw him. And I will freely admit I proper ugly cried listening and watching Brenda talk about this in an interview on 60 Minutes Australia, because Brenda says that now she just wishes that morning at the airport she had thanked Min for everything he had done, for being an amazing dad and for working so hard to provide for her and her brothers. Just in case you're already feeling a little bit emotional, this is your warning to prepare yourself because it gets worse. So back in Australia, news of the murders was spreading like wildfire. Like there was this huge media frenzy going on. And so Brenda, on her school trip on the other side of the world, the way she found out that her entire family had been murdered was her classmates all of a sudden coming up to her one after the other, asking her if she was okay, because they had seen the news stories on social media. And Brenda originally thought that it had to have been some cruel joke, that there had to be a mistake, it had to have been someone else's family, until she saw a picture of her house on one of the stories on Facebook. But it still didn't really sink in until she was quickly flown back home to be greeted at the gate by police, who then escorted her to a private room at the airport where she was met with her auntie and uncle, Kathy and Robert. And Brenda says it was only when Kathy, still hysterical and crying, pulled her into this big hug that it finally sunk in that this was real, that her entire family was gone. The funeral for Min, Lily, Irene, Henry, and Terry took place just a few days later, and Brenda was just incredibly brave and gave a tearful speech that she says she can barely even remember now. I mean, she's just 15 years old and coming to terms with losing her entire family. And her grandparents, Min and Kathy's parents, gave a speech as well, and they were just so distraught. Like, their grief was palpable. It was impossible not to mourn along with them. Oh, hi. Are you here for emotional support? You're so clever. How did you know? Yeah, I know. Brenda did go back to her home briefly, and she said that she ideally would have even wanted to just live there on her own, but it was just too much. Plus, at just 15 years old, she wasn't legally permitted to live alone. And so she was thankfully taken in by her Auntie Kathy and Uncle Robert. So once again, it's just so fortunate that this family was so close and had each other to grieve with and lean on. And over the months as the investigation into the murders took place, Kathy and Robert kind of just did their best to step up and step into that role of the family that Brenda had lost. And they were there day to day caring for her when she went back to school. They were right there making her lunches and dropping her off. And they even ended up taking over Min's agency. And meanwhile, when it came to the investigation itself, police had worked out a pretty soft timeline for the night that the murders had taken place. The time of death was estimated to be sometime between 10:30 p.m. on the 17th of July and 2 a.m. on the 18th of July, a time that all of the family members were asleep or at least lying in their beds. There was CCTV footage of men delivering newspapers to a service station near the LIN family home at 9:45 p.m. after Friday night family dinner. So police were at least able to know for sure that the murders took place after that time. And it was also found that the electricity to the house was cut off by someone flicking a switch in the power box outside at some point before 2 a.m., presumably the killer or killers. When it came to the order that the victims were killed in, it looked as though Min and Lily had been killed first, followed by Lily's sister, Irene, in the next bedroom. And then the killer had continued down the hallway to 12-year-old Henry and 9-year-old Terry's room. And it was determined from the blood spatter in their room that either one or both of the boys had been awake when they were attacked and that they had been chased around and fought against their killer. It's so hard to think about how terrified those two little boys must have been in their final moments. Now, I remember how absolutely berserk the media coverage was of this case when it happened, and some of the theories that floated around were pretty wild and out there. For instance, there were whispers that the Chinese mafia were involved, that it was a random robbery gone wrong, and one of the big theories was that Min himself had been the target and everyone else had been collateral damage, because there had been this string of robberies of armor guard trucks that had taken place while these trucks were stopped to fill up ATMs. And Coincidentally, Min had actually been a witness of one of these robberies not too long at all before the murders had taken place. So what if he had been murdered to prevent him from testifying in court? But none of these theories really matched up with the evidence. At the crime scene, it was pretty apparent that at least some planning had gone into the murders, as all of the bloody prints found were smudged, signaling that the killer or killers had worn gloves. And also, while the murder weapon itself, which was assumed to be a hammer, was never found, the police found evidence to suggest that the killer had gone to the effort of binding the weapon to their wrist so that they wouldn't lose their grip during the attack, which, I mean, I have never heard of a killer going to the effort of tying a weapon to themselves, and the idea of someone being able to plan a murder to that level of detail, I may have lost a little bit of sleep over that. Like, that legit terrifies me. Looking at all of the windows and doors in the house, there were no signs of forced entry and nothing had been stolen. So breaking and entering and robbery were all ruled out pretty early on. And instead, police started leaning into the idea that the murders had been committed by someone who knew both the family and their home very well, because the killer or killers had to have had easy access to a key or have owned a copy themselves. They also had to have known the layout of the house itself pretty damn freaking well to be able to navigate it in pitch darkness, seeing as they had switched off the electricity and there were no street lights around. There was also barely even a moon in the sky that night, so it would have been pitch dark. Finally, the only bedroom door without blood on the doorknob was Brenda's, suggesting that the killer hadn't even bothered going into her room at all because they knew she was away on her class trip to New Caledonia. Cementing this idea was the fact that there were 24 shoe prints found throughout the house, all belonging to the same type of shoe, an Asics brand gel-type sneaker in men's US size 8.5 to 10.5. And the only bedroom where these prints weren't found was Brenda's. So how big of a factor in the murders was it that the killer had known that Brenda wasn't going to be there that night? Had they planned it that way, or had it just been a coincidence? Because despite all of the interviews that police were conducting, no one could suggest anyone that would have wanted to hurt the LIN family. Even Kathy and Robert, who were interviewed for hours on end, had no names to give to police as to who they thought had murdered their family. And so the couple held a very emotional press conference, crying and just pleading with the public for anyone with information to please come forward. But the murders ended up going unsolved for months and months. And all of that time, the police were just under more and more pressure from the public to solve the case and get the killer behind bars. And so naturally, with the information they had gathered, I imagine a lot of you guys are already there, police started looking heavily into Robert Z. And despite the fact that Robert had been fully cooperative during the investigation and that emotional plea that he and Kathy had made to the public for information that would bring his family's killer to justice, when investigators did start looking into Robert as a suspect, everything just all of a sudden started neatly falling into place very quickly. Robert had a key. He lived just a 3-minute walk from the LIN family home. He knew the home and he had motive. So Robert's experience of immigrating from China to Australia had been quite different to Min's. Like, Min's story of coming to Australia with nothing and building the news agency from the ground up into this huge success kind of had that fairy tale, rags to riches element to it. I mean, obviously Min had worked very hard to make that a reality, but everything had kind of worked out for him. And this could not be further from the truth for Robert. Robert claimed to police that he had been an ear, nose and throat doctor in China, but probably inspired by Min's success with the news agency, when Robert and Kathy came to Australia in 2006, Robert had opened up a restaurant in Melbourne and had big plans of flying over all these specialty chefs in from China, but the restaurant had failed and Robert had had no choice but to close it down, and he had been unemployed ever since. And this was when Robert and Kathy had moved to Sydney, just around the corner from Min and the rest of the LIN family. And so police formed this theory that over time, Robert, basically with all his feelings hurt because he was already humiliated by the failure of his restaurant in Melbourne and then moving to Sydney and witnessing all of Min's success, he had become incredibly jealous and infuriated by what he perceived to be his lowly status within the family. And all of these hurt feelings had driven him to murder Min and his family in a fit of envy and rage. And Robert's odd behavior after the murders just intensified the suspicions that police were forming, because despite his claim that he had been a doctor back in China, Robert hadn't even attempted to give any medical assistance to any of the victims. Instead, he had left the crime scene before police had arrived to drive half an hour away to pick up his in-laws and bring them back to the house. And he had also been really nervous and jittery in all of the police interviews. And the only time he had shown any emotion at all was while talking about Henry and Terry, especially Henry, because they had been really close and loved playing badminton together. And out of everything else he could have been doing at bright and early on a Saturday morning, Robert had been cleaning his garage the same morning that the bodies had been discovered, leading police to wonder if maybe he had been attempting to clean up evidence. Of course, with Robert becoming their prime suspect, pretty much immediately, police were faced with this huge dilemma because poor Brenda, who had lost her entire family, was now potentially living with their killer. And after a bit of sussing it out and profiling, investigators came to the conclusion that Brenda wasn't in any danger. And surely if Robert had wanted to kill Brenda, he wouldn't have committed the murders on a night that he knew she wasn't going to be home. But just to be safe, hidden cameras were set up around Robert and Kathy's home, and police also tapped their phones and carried out this big, huge surveillance operation for 6 months. And this, best friends, is where we come back to those shoe prints found at the crime scene from the Asics sneakers that the killer had been wearing. Now, these came up in an interview with Kathy, and it seems like this was all very intentional on the part of police, like they were just dropping it in to see where it would lead. And sure enough, when they told Kathy about these shoe prints, she just casually let it slip that Asics were Robert's favorite brand of shoes to wear. And she even said that that particular type of sneaker that police had narrowed the prints down to, which it's worth noting, had been out of production since 2005, were Robert's favorite pair of sneakers. Also, just on top of that, Robert wore these sneakers in a US men's size 9.5, smack bang in that 8.5 to 10.5 size range that police had originally put forward. And then, only days after this interview where Kathy found out about the shoe prints, Robert was caught on the hidden cameras placed in his house, cutting up multiple Asics shoe boxes and putting the shredded bits of cardboard in a bucket of water before flushing them down the toilet. So at this point, we're talking May 2010, 10 months after the murders, police were finally like, okay, we've got enough, let's get in there. And during their search of the Z family home, they never found the sneakers in question themselves, which is odd, right? Because Kathy said that these sneakers were Robert's favorites. And so you would have thought that they would be right there with his other shoes, and they weren't. But police did find family photos of Robert wearing these sneakers. And since, like we've mentioned, police knew that Robert had been up and about cleaning his garage the very morning after the murders, that was one of the first areas that they zeroed in on. And sure enough, in a far corner of this garage, underneath a big chest of drawers, they found a dark greyish-brown stain, which when they tested on the scene gave a strong positive response for biological matter, meaning that it was almost certainly blood. This stain was relatively small. It was about 2 centimeters by 6 centimeters, and it became known as stain 91. And it was categorized by experts as a transfer stain. So it had gotten there by something that was soaked in blood, like a bag or clothing or a weapon even, being placed on the floor and the blood transferring from the item to the floor. And it was decided at this time that forensic labs in Australia weren't quite up for the task of processing the stain. And so the sample was sent off to a specialty lab in the US for DNA testing. And this testing confirmed that the stain was made up of human blood and that it contained the DNA of not just one, but 4 of the victims in the LIN family. And once those results came in just like that on the 5th of May 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders, Robert Z was arrested for the murders of Min, Lily, Irene, Henry, and Terry, and he was held without bail. Now, Robert had always claimed that the night of the murders, after he and Kathy and their son had come home from the Friday night dinner, Kathy had gone to bed relatively early, whereas he had stayed up for a little while surfing the net, watching movies, and also having a bath before he went to bed around 2 a.m. And Kathy had always backed up that alibi, saying that Robert was asleep in bed with her all of that time. Even though, if Kathy was asleep herself, I just don't understand how much weight that would hold to corroborate Robert's alibi. But while in prison, while awaiting his trial, Robert met a fellow inmate that would later become known as Witness A. And Witness A would testify at trial that Robert had told him that he had sedated Kathy that night so that he could sneak out of the house, commit the murders, and then sneak back into bed without waking her. And Witness A had a lot more to tell the court when Robert's trial began in May 2014, where Robert pled not guilty. Witness A testified that Robert had said that he had bought the murder weapon, which he told him was a hammer, intentionally at this specific discount store because he believed that they had dummy security cameras, so there would be no footage of him making the purchase. And Robert told him that he still had access to the hammer, but he was worried that there was footage of him disposing of it. The jury also heard that Robert had made plans with a dirty cop that Witness A had put him into contact with to plant evidence in order to frame an innocent man for the murders. And obviously all of this is insanely incriminating, but there are just a couple of things worth mentioning here. Firstly, Witness A, who was a career criminal, was also a police informant who was receiving some pretty hefty compensation in terms of having his jail sentence reduced in return for his part in having Robert spill all of these secrets. And while some of these conversations between Robert and Witness A were recorded, others weren't. And so it really came down to Witness A's word versus Robert's, who of course denied it all. Also, that dirty cop that Robert had made plans with to frame someone else for the murders wasn't a dirty cop at all. He was an undercover cop, again, recording their conversations with the ultimate goal being to get Robert to incriminate himself. But sitting there in the courtroom listening to all of this was the now 17-year-old Brenda, who up until this point had totally supported Robert and fully believed that he was innocent. But she sat there listening to all of this confronting evidence, and it's like it was finally dawning on her that her own uncle, whose house she was still living in, really could have murdered her entire family. And she realized that if he had really done this, then there was a secret that she had been keeping that she needed to share because it changed everything about the case. And so it was during this trial that Brenda told her lawyer that she had been sexually abused by Robert. And this abuse had been going on for years, since before the murders had taken place. And after the murders, when she had moved into his home, the abuse had not just continued, but escalated. And it was this incredibly brave revelation from Brenda that resulted in this trial being completely abandoned because it did change everything. And a whole new trial began a few months later in August 2014. And in this second trial, prosecutors now alleged that it hadn't just been jealousy and humiliation that had driven Robert to murder, but also his sexual obsession with his own niece. Like, now it made so much sense that Robert had committed the murders on a night that he knew Brenda wasn't going to be there. And it turned out it went even further than that, because after the murders, Robert had even kicked his in-laws out of their home that Min had bought for them, so that Brenda wouldn't have the option to live with her grandparents, and instead her only choice would be to live with Robert under his roof. Oh, hi. I know. How evil is that? Your radar is on point today. Meanwhile, the defense's key argument was that Robert had only been targeted by police in the first place because they were under so much pressure to solve the case. And so when none of the theories that they'd investigated had panned out, they had zeroed in hard on Robert as their prime suspect. Basically, they were saying it was that classic case that admittedly we have seen so many times where investigators were like, okay, we think this guy did it. Let's find stuff to prove it and just ignore everything else. And the defense did have a solid case because even the most damning piece of evidence, stain 91 found in Robert's garage, the blood that contained the DNA of 4 of the victims, fell so incredibly far short of the mark to prove that he was guilty. Firstly, when I say that it contained 4 of the victims' DNA, it was one of those instances where it was 1 in however many million chance that it wasn't their DNA, which I hear that and I'm like, okay, so what you're saying is it was their DNA. But in a court of law, scientifically, it still leaves that insy-bitsy little tiny room of doubt. And there was also the fact that Brenda's DNA could not be excluded from the sample during the lab analysis. And if some of her blood was in that stain, then there was no way that it was related to the murders at all. The defense also brought up that the Lin family would visit that house all of the time. They would regularly play games together in that garage. And seeing as there was no way to determine how old the stain was, there was nothing to say that it hadn't gotten there months or even years prior to the murders. And even if the blood had gotten there after the murders, Robert and Kathy had been inside the Lin family home and discovered the bodies. So it was totally conceivable that in that process, they could have stepped in blood at the crime scene and then tracked the blood onto the floor of their garage. The defense also brought up their own expert who said that according to their analysis, the shoe prints found at the crime scene could have come from a number of different sneakers, not necessarily the Asics gels that Robert loved and had never been found. And they said that the only reason that Robert had destroyed those shoe boxes was because when Kathy had told him about what police had told her about the shoe prints, he was terrified that he was going to be framed for the murders. Also, it turned out that analysis of Robert's computer had shown that he had been active on there up until 2 a.m. that night, coinciding with his alibi that he had gone to bed at 2 a.m. and directly conflicting with that time of death window of 10:30 to 2 a.m. But most importantly, the defense argued that even if we do believe that Robert had known that house well enough to potentially have been able to navigate his way around in the pitch dark, from there, it was almost an impossible stretch of the imagination to believe that Robert, acting on his own, had been able to murder 5 people without waking up others in the process, without the alarm being raised and him being overpowered. Min and Lily were right next to each other in bed. How did the murder of one not wake up the other? It was as though someone else had to have been there to assist or at least keep the other victims quiet and in line. And yet, it had been the police themselves to come to the conclusion from the shoe prints that the killer had acted alone. The prosecution's response to all of this was to point out that Min was gifted in martial arts, and he had actually demonstrated to witness A, the jailhouse informant, how applying pressure to a particular spot of the neck could completely incapacitate a victim in seconds. And Robert did claim to have been an ear, nose, and throat specialist in China, so it was possible that his surgical knowledge of the neck area in general may have assisted him in rendering his victims helpless more easily and quickly than your average assailant. But this whole second trial, though, also had to be abandoned because the judge was suffering health issues and became too ill to continue. Robert's third trial commenced in February 2015, but this trial also failed because the jury just could not reach a unanimous verdict. And so in December of that year, pending his fourth trial, Robert was released from prison on bail because by this point, he had been behind bars for nearly 5 years murders without a conviction. So if he was innocent, this was a huge failure of the justice system. And even then, the requirements of the bail were super intense. And amongst other stipulations, like Robert needing to hand over his passport, which is fair enough, Robert also had to check in with his bail officer 3 times a day. So Robert's 4th trial began in June 2016 with the same judge that had presided over the previous trial, Justice Elizabeth Fullerton. And this time as well, the jury just could not reach a unanimous verdict. And so in January 2017, the trial ended with Justice Fullerton accepting an 11-1 guilty verdict from the jury for 5 counts of murder. And she sentenced Robert to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Robert filed an appeal in June 2020 with his lawyers saying that the DNA evidence, presumably stain 91, was, quote, misleading, confusing, and unfairly prejudicial. But this appeal was dismissed in February 2021, and that's where this case stands as of today. I'm happy to report that today Brenda is doing well. I mean, obviously she's been through so much and still misses her family every day, but she says that today she's focused on living a life that would make her family proud and just being grateful for all of the people that gathered together to help her after the murders. And I guess that was the benefit of the case being so heavily covered in the media, was that people really came together to help Brenda and were all rooting for her. Like even the real estate company that sold the LIN family home after the murders put the commission into a fund in Brenda's name, wanting to make sure that she would still be able to achieve the bright future that her parents, Min and Lily, had always had in mind for her. When it comes to Brenda's aunt, Kathy Z, Kathy still stands by her husband Robert to this day and proclaims his innocence. And I just don't know how to feel about Kathy. Even Robert's defense admitted that Kathy at times had lied to police on Robert's behalf, but they say it wasn't to cover for him. It was just because, like Robert claims, she was convinced that he was being framed by the police for the murders. During that 6-month surveillance operation that police carried out, there was this recording of a phone call captured in which Robert was coaching Kathy what to tell police about what they had seen at the crime scene when they discovered the bodies. Like in this phone call, Robert is saying, okay, so you need to say that we saw this person lying here and that door was slightly ajar. And even at the crime scene on that morning, even though Kathy still swears to this day that it had been all her that told the police to check under that blanket for Min's body, that she just had a feeling that he was under there, it's believed by a lot of people that it was really Robert who told her to prompt the police to look there. The further you look into it, like the messier it gets. I just don't know what to believe about what Kathy knew and how much she covered for Robert and for what reasons. And it's another one of those messy cases, yet again, where I feel like he did it, but there is evidence that makes me second guess myself, which I believe is the literal definition of reasonable doubt. And there is just so much that doesn't add up for me. Like, to believe that Robert committed these murders, you have to believe that he had the foresight to tie a murder weapon to his wrist so that he didn't lose grip during the attack, but also that he used his key to get into the house and wore his favorite pair of sneakers that would easily lead investigators directly to him. Like, it just does not surprise me at all that there were 2 juries that could not come to a unanimous verdict. I just don't know. And so, as usual, I would love to hear what your guys' take is on this case, because this hangout does not have to end here. We can all just meet up in the comments section below and talk it out. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, you can let me know by giving it a big thumbs up. And if you are still sat there watching and not already subscribed, then I would just do the biggest happy dance if you did that. And we can make this a regular thing and be best friends forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, ever, forever. Hi, did you come to say bye? You gave such good emotional support today. You were on fleek. You're going to get so many treats tonight. Yes, you are. Thank you so much again for spending this time with me and Lily today. I know there is literally like a billion videos on YouTube, so the fact that you chose to watch this one and hang out with us means the absolute world. I hope you have a magical week, and me and Lily will be counting down the hours until we see you in the next one. Bye.